Hi, everyone. Raza Bashir here, Chief Innovation Officer at Iovate MuscleTech. And today we got a special guest, Dr. William Wallace. He's got a PhD in health and human performance, and he's also a peer-reviewed researcher, the host of the Daily Value podcast. And I really enjoy his podcast. And what I really like about your work, William, is that, even people who kind of live and breathe, this industry, science, nutrition, we get a lot out of it. From all the people that I talk to, we find it really educational. So I think, not only is it approachable for the general public, but I just think anybody with an interest can really benefit from it. So really great to have you on here.
No, thank you. Thank you very much for the kind words. Looking forward to this conversation.
Maybe before we kind of dive in to some of the science and some of the topics here, I'd love to just, hear a little bit about your journey, how you got interested in nutrition and performance, and maybe that's how that even shaped, the way you educate and the way you approach it today.
Sure. Yeah. I'll try to give the abridged version here. I think this kind of goes back to my time in my undergrad at Keene State College in New Hampshire, a small state school in New Hampshire, whose really only claim to fame at the time was that we were always on Playboy's top 10 party schools in the country. I guess when you're out in the sticks up north, what more do you have to do? But at the time, I had graduated with a degree in occupational safety and health that I was not happy with. I didn't feel like it was something I was ever going to use. Now, like, funny enough, come full circle is like I've made my rounds with brands, contract manufacturers, regulatory. I've actually had to use some of that OSHA background, so it's kind of funny. But when I had graduated, I didn't think this was something I wanted to do with my life. I was always interested in the exercise sciences. I was that kid in college who was always going into GNC, buying product. It's funny that we're here now because MuscleTech was always one of those products in the early 2000s, mid 2000s that you really kind of like you were honored to use, and you sought that, especially if you were young and into fitness. And at a time, the products I couldn't really afford, but if I had the money, I would buy the MuscleTech product because there was a certain promise that with this you could elevate your performance. So I was always a bit of a supplement junkie and a fitness junkie in college. I knew I was interested in those things, and I knew that I wanted to take that to the next level. So I went to grad school at the University of Tampa and got a master's in exercise and nutrition sciences. It was after my first semester there that I conducted my master's thesis, and then upon presenting that to my classmates, I was invited to work in the lab on site, which was kind of a coveted position at the time. There was really only like 11 or 13 spots, but everybody went to school there at the time to work in the lab. So shortly thereafter, I was able to work my way up the ranks of my classmates in the lab. And then I was invited to go work at a contract research organization after I finished my tenure during my master's. And I did that for a couple of years. So I was involved in the clinical research, specifically on, at least the clinical research side of the R&D pipeline, because most of the studies we were doing were being conducted for raw material suppliers to test new ingredients coming to market, trying to get new claims for existing ingredients and things of that nature. So that was my first exposure to talking to industry professionals. And from there, with that experience and those connections, I was hired to work discovery research at the company Life Extension in Fort Lauderdale. And at the same time was acquiring my doctorate. So to kind of now speed up the story, after my doctorate was finished, I moved into the manufacturing sector to lead R&D and quality for a manufacturing facility. So in that time, I've led audits with almost every third-party certification body that operates in North America. I've worked directly with the FDA. I build quality systems at the brand, manufacturing, and supplier level. And so that's kind of how we arrived at where I'm at today.
Wow, fascinating. So along your journey, has there, William, has there been any like specific just based on, your understanding and knowledge of, biology and the body, is there any specific, like, ingredients that, you experimented with that had, like, a profound effect on you along the way?
Certainly, I think so. Of course, I have things I take that are entirely, contextualized to my life circumstances. But there are actually a number of ingredients. I kind of lump ingredients into different categories, just kind of like a fun lists that I keep. One of them is ingredients that I consider widely applicable, but not necessarily necessary for everybody, but widely applicable. And within that list, I keep some micronutrients that are just overly applicable, but
Yeah.
I try not to add in too many micronutrients, because when you say, "Hey, these are widely applicable," you could rationalize every single essential nutrient,
Right.
in a list like that. So I have this list where it's like these are widely applicable to people. They're not always necessary. I have another list of like the top 3 most underrated raw materials that I don't see people giving enough love to. So if you're interested in hearing either one of those, then I can certainly spew that.
Maybe, I mean, I'd love to hear some of the ones that you think are underrated. Yeah, that'd be pretty interesting.
Yeah, so at least for me, right, there's in no particular order, but one of which has been in the news recently, is lithium orotate. And so I think that some people might be aware of the Harvard study that came out a couple of months ago. It was a preclinical rodent study showing that lithium orotate was actually able to explain many of the hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease, and at least in that model, reverse some of the hallmarks. And it was more effective than lithium carbonate, which has been the standard salt form of lithium used to treat things like bipolar disorder in humans. And so that was a really unique study. But prior to that, it goes back to at least 2017 when I stumbled upon some of the data. I was really interested in a lot of the epidemiological data, which a lot of times I don't get that interested in that, but I found it quite compelling that in different areas of the world that it had been replicated that places with higher amounts of elemental lithium in drinking water had lower rates of mood disorders, they had lower rates of suicide, and they had lower rates of violent crimes. And that was replicated about 6 times over. And so you think, wow, okay, that's compelling. There's been small pilot trials done in people with pre-dementia, mild cognitive decline, showing that microgram doses could help to reduce the slope of cognitive decline. And so all of those things led me to believe that there was something about lithium that just made a lot of sense for most people. And the more that I've dug into that and the history of that, the more interested I've been in that. Is such a simple molecule, has such a low molecular weight, was one of the first metals discovered. And I don't think it gets enough recognition and love by people, but I think that we're going to be seeing that change in the coming years here.
Yeah. Okay, I mean, that'll be interesting to see, yeah, how that evolves. You got me thinking a little bit about the cognition here, and one of the most classic ingredients that people are always consuming, whether it's their pre-workout, it's through coffee, even how people meet, is caffeine, right? Can you tell us just a little bit about sort of like the benefits and the mechanisms around methylxanthines, in particular caffeine and maybe some of its metabolites?
Sure. I mean, caffeine is God. I mean, world's favorite drug, right? I certainly love
Yeah.
1, 2, 3 cups of coffee in a day. I mean, I guess quick breakdown of that one. Most of us know that caffeine antagonizes adenosine receptors. Some people say it acts as a reverse agonist because not only does it antagonize, it kind of stimulates the opposite effect of what you would have from true adenosine receptor agonism.
Yeah.
And so within that, I mean, caffeine breaks down into, like you say, other methylxanthines. Those include paraxanthine, theobromine, theophylline. Each of those have unique mechanisms kind of specific to those compounds. All of them share the mechanism that they block adenosine receptors, which thereby stimulate increased alertness, because adenosine is more of a depressing molecule or depressing signaling. But some of those methylxanthines, or I'd say all of those methylxanthines, and their antagonism of adenosine 2A receptors is unique because adenosine 2A is highly abundant in the striatum and interacts with D2 dopamine receptors. And so when you block those adenosine receptors in that area, what you get is increased dopaminergic transmission, increased glutamate transmission. And so pretty much all of those methylxanthines do that. Now, some people who have mutations in that adenosine 2A receptor may not respond favorably to methylxanthines, and that's kind of the case across all of them. Those would be people with the who are homozygous for the TT variant. Essentially, those adenosine receptors are either increased in expression or sensitivity, and so any methylxanthine activity, or at least low levels of methylxanthine activity, could overstimulate somebody, have them feeling anxious, jittery, etc. Now, where you start to look at some of the differing effects of these methylxanthines and see like where one might be favorable versus another, you could look at theobromine and theophylline, which are largely responsible for a lot of caffeine's cardiovascular effects, either vasoconstrictive or vasodilatory, depending on what tissues in the body that they're interacting with and at what concentration. So those are kind of responsible for the cardiovascular effects of caffeine, which a lot of people do perceive as negative. One, depending on how they respond to, or depending on how they respond to caffeine via adenosine receptor activation, but also depending on how they metabolize caffeine via the CYP1A2 enzyme. So that's, talk about that in a moment. But paraxanthine, on the other hand, that particular methylxanthine does not have the adrenergic activity that theobromine and theophylline have. It kind of uniquely sticks on acting to those adenosine receptors. So its effects are kind of more isolated into central nervous system activity, but it's unique in that it does not quite provide the cardiovascular effects that caffeine gives, that some people might perceive as positive, some people might perceive as negative, depending on the rate at which you're metabolizing caffeine and also how you respond to adenosine receptor antagonism.
Got it. I think it's really interesting because we've done a lot of work on paraxanthine, and it probably all started from us knowing the benefits of methylxanthines and caffeine in particular, right? From an adrenergic perspective, being able to increase performance. But what we found was, and even personally, what I find is, after, let's call it 12 p.m., many individuals just find that, that the way essentially they can't eliminate that caffeine fast enough. So it's in the bloodstream for a long period of time. And it's probably related to what you mentioned, those other metabolites, right? Like theophylline and theobromine, which have a longer half-life. Is there, and I think you kind of touched on this with the CYP1A2 enzyme, is there genetic differences then, or lifestyle differences that can play a role there and just how people respond?
Yeah, I mean, certainly. So CYP1A2, for people that don't know, is the primary enzyme through which caffeine and other methylxanthines are metabolized. And so you're either classified, traditionally as a slow metabolizer or a fast metabolizer. You fall into the camp of a slow metabolizer if you're homozygous for the CC variant of that gene. So meaning you have two CC alleles.
Yeah.
You're a fast metabolizer if you're homozygous for the AA variant. But there are also people who have one A allele and one C allele, which kind of puts them at a moderate metabolizer rate. So the rate of caffeine metabolism, the half-life can be anywhere from 2.5 hours up to 9, and in rare cases, plus hours in some very, very slow metabolizers. So if you actually break down the data on what percent of the population falls into what category, actually like 49, so close to 50% of the population falls into the fast metabolizer category,
Yeah.
which would have the half-life of caffeine range from 2.5 to 5 hours in that group. The other 42% of the population is considered a moderate metabolizer. So you would have them fall in kind of the caffeine half-life of 3 up to 6 hour range. And then really only 9% of the world's population would actually be considered slow metabolizers if you were just looking at their genetic profile. Of course, there are lifestyle factors that play a role here as well. But if we're just looking at genetics, it really is kind of a small proportion of people. But that being said, not everybody who's a slow metabolizer, not everybody who's a slow metabolizer perceives the effects of caffeine as bad for them. Not everybody who is a fast metabolizer of caffeine perceives the effects as good for them. Some people might not like some of the cardiovascular effects that caffeine triggers. But that's how the population kind of, stacks up as far as lifestyle factors. I think most people have heard these things, but things like oral contraceptives slow the metabolism of caffeine in people. Things like nicotine tend to increase the metabolism rate of caffeine in people. But if you break it down, now, I mean, you brought up the other methylxanthines and their rate of metabolism. So in most of the population, the half-life of paraxanthine would be the shortest at approximately 3 hours. And so in that respect, of all the methylxanthines, paraxanthine might be the most favorable for people, be you a fast metabolizer or a slow metabolizer, that do not want adverse effects of caffeine that carry on later in the day that may not be perceived, say, until later, that you may not perceive at all. Some people don't know that they can have sleep disruption up to 12 hours later from caffeine that they had way earlier in the day. And so paraxanthine might be the most favorable methylxanthine for people who want the effects of caffeine, or at least some of the effects of caffeine, but shorter lived. And so that kind of window of benefit is much more flexible with paraxanthine as opposed to theobromine or theophylline, which kind of range from 4 hours really up to 8 hours of half-life.
You bring up such a good point around, the differences in metabolism and where, when I think about that 50%, right? Like 50% of that are fast metabolizers, and then the balance that are moderate to slow, and how that although caffeine can be beneficial, for everyone, the fact that it can take so long to metabolize just gives an opportunity for sort of customization or flexibility that we have now that we didn't necessarily have in supplements before. And where paraxanthine in particular, I think where it can help, consumers and people that have tried taking, pre-workout stimulants with caffeine, and then maybe they found that it was lingering and they're, lingering for a long period of time. And, to your point, they weren't, necessarily getting as good quality of sleep. And then it kind of leads to that vicious cycle where you need it again first thing in the morning. And again, just like everyone, I love my stimulants. It just that can kind of just lead to this sort of compounding effect where, you're not getting as good quality sleep and you keep turning to stimulants. And I think it's just really interesting to kind of just recap that, that's now we have, opportunities where, okay, well, if you respond well to caffeine, certainly you could have large doses of, coffee or pre-workout or whatever your favorite stimulant beverage is. But if you're someone who's more sensitive or maybe perhaps trains at night, try, paraxanthine, based options as an alternative.
Yeah, I think you provide a good point, because even me, who, like, I love caffeine, there's no reason for me to turn away from it. I
Yeah.
mean, of course, paraxanthine is nice if it's on hand, but admittedly, I haven't actually had the opportunity to use paraxanthine myself at this point. So really, I'm speaking from more mechanistic know-how than I am from experience itself. But even for myself, I stopped drinking caffeine. I cut myself off at 3 p.m. every day, absolute latest. And a lot of my days drag on. Like I'm not wrapping up my work until 8, sometimes 9 p.m. And come that 6, 7 o'clock hour, I wish I had something. I'm like, man, I wish I could have a cup of coffee right now, but I know that my sleep
Right.
is going to suffer. And so you just have to muscle through it. And so although I don't know what my genetics say on the matter, I'm not sure if I fall into slow or fast metabolizer. But given my work schedule, given the actual pharmacokinetics of paraxanthine, it seems for me as though it could be uh, a suitable tool to use later in the evenings. And to your point, there are a lot of athletes that train late in the day. There are a lot of athletes that use MuscleTech ingredients, that use ingredients and products that are put on the market by Iovate, and their schedules are so variable. And so, to your point, I think one of the cool things about the day and age we live in is now the flexibility that's been given to us with these things. Like I'm not here to be like rah paraxanthine, but it certainly does add flexibility to your toolkit of maybe you like caffeine early in the day, maybe you want to try to resort to paraxanthine later so that you can actually perform at a high level later in the day without hurting yourself. For a long time, we had theobromine, but theobromine by itself, I don't think was ever popularized like people thought it might be. And some of that might have to do with its effects on the adrenergic system and thus the cardiovascular system. But paraxanthine being a newer ingredient, at least again, not having used it is interesting in concept because there's, I'm aware of preclinical data. I believe it's 2023 preclinical data showing that, in a dose of paraxanthine that was equal to a dose of caffeine showed less toxicity side effects in rodents. And so in that, I don't think anybody's probably consuming that much caffeine from coffee and paraxanthine daily. But it helps to know that it has a favorable toxicological profile because that is one of the reasons that something like theophylline has not been commercialized popularly, because it does have a rather low threshold for toxicity, being that only approximately 7 to 8% of caffeine is broken down into theophylline. If you were to give it in high concentrations, its toxicity threshold is far, far lower than an equal dose of caffeine or paraxanthine. So it helps to know that paraxanthine, compared to other methylxanthines, has a favorable toxicological profile as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So the fact that there's more ingredients in the toolkit is definitely a benefit to people. And one of the things that we're seeing showing up a lot now are peptides. Right, we're seeing it in more and more protocols and elite protocols. So I thought it'd be good to kind of get your perspective on it, and maybe even just telling us a little bit about what peptides are and how they can be beneficial.
Sure. I guess it helps to start with what peptides are. Essentially, peptides are strings of amino acids that are connected covalently via a peptide bond. And peptides range from 2 amino acids up to near 100. Once you hit 90 or 100 amino acids, you hit a molecular weight of approximately 10,000 Daltons. Once you hit that threshold, you're kind of operating in small protein territory.
Yeah.
But peptides that are 2 to 20 amino acids in sequence, usually called oligopeptides, 20 up to 90 peptides, you have polypeptides. And so peptides appear in all kinds of assortments, all kinds of quantities. And to your point, peptide just seems to be a buzzword today, not only for for the consumer, for somebody looking to be educated, the industry professionals themselves. Everybody is interested in the peptide space. Everybody wants to get into the peptide space, and so the benefits of peptides a lot of times really depend on the structure of the peptide and the length of the peptide, but they vary, so much in function and capacity.
Yeah, so that's a great introduction to it, and but right now, one of the, fastest growing, categories, is creatine, and, I think, all of us, we love creatine, especially us that have been involved, in the sports nutrition, area for quite some time, and I thought it'd be kinda beneficial to get your take on creatine in particular. Maybe, given it's been around for so long, is there any, for those who aren't taking it today, anything that you'd want to emphasize, some of the key benefits, what one might consider, taking a classic ingredient like creatine, just given all the research behind it?
Yeah, yeah, I certainly love me some creatine and am absolutely an advocate for it. That creatine, no surprise, falls into my list of, widely applicable supplemental compounds or single ingredients to use outside of just dietary intake alone. And I think that the creatine conversation, even though we're being inundated with it right now, I personally think that it continues to get more and more interesting. We know that traditionally it's been looked at as a performance enhancer, started as physical performance, then now people are very interested in cognitive performance. But beyond that, I think that the conversation still has room to evolve. And I think one of the more interesting takes on creatine that I've come across recently is creatine as a mitochondrial theranostic agent. And so when I say theranostic, I mean that creatine as a molecule might be able to be used to diagnose or help diagnose certain disorders that are kind of underlined by, this ambiguous term we always hear of mitochondrial dysfunction. And almost every chronic condition kind of has that floating in the background. But it's always been something that's been really hard to measure and it's been really hard to treat. So, on the diagnostic side of things, there are groups of people out there right now trying to create reference standards for creatine and also develop repletion and depletion protocols to see if you can measure mitochondrial reserve that way. And so, in that way, you could help diagnose disorders early on as you see mitochondrial reserve maybe diminishing. Now, on the therapeutic side of things, creatine interacts with mitochondria in ways that I don't think are talked about enough publicly. And one of those ways is through the creatine kinase enzyme. We know that that enzyme operates in the mitochondria. It's responsible for converting creatine into phosphocreatine so that it can then be used for energy consumption in other parts of a cell. Creatine kinase interacts very uniquely with a lipid called cardiolipin, which basically is responsible for the structural integrity of the mitochondrial inner membrane. Actually, cardiolipin accounts for 20% of all lipids in the inner mitochondrial membrane. It also anchors complex 3 through 5 of the electron transport chain in place, and creatine kinase helps to stabilize cardiolipin. Creatine kinase activity and expression is highly dependent on the presence of creatine. So the more creatine we have, the more likely creatine kinase is operating how it needs to and interacting with something like cardiolipin how it needs to support structural integrity and electron transport in a mitochondria. That's just one of the ways it interacts with the mitochondria. Creatine in preclinical models has also been shown to inhibit the opening of the mitochondrial permeability transition pore. That's a little channel in mitochondria that if cytochrome C leaks out, that pore opens during stress. And if it's open, cytochrome C, which is an electron courier of the electron transport chain, can leak out of the pore. And if it does so, that actually serves as an apoptotic signal for a cell. In other words, it triggers cell death. So creatine under stressful conditions has shown to limit the opening of the mitochondrial permeability transition pore. Outside of that, we know that creatine has weak, but it's there, free radical scavenging activity. It can also support antioxidant status indirectly because it takes some of the pressure off NADH dependent pathways. NADH is then more available to be used for the synthesis of glutathione. So there's several ways in which creatine support mitochondrial health that go kind of beyond performance. Of course, I think we could all argue if our mitochondria are operating at top efficiency, then we can perform better physically, we can perform better cognitively. But I just think that there's more about the creatine story that needs to be told publicly.
Yeah, that information you shared is really remarkable, and I completely agree with you on the mitochondrial piece. Mitochondrial dysfunction is just behind a lot of different sort of elements behind people don't realize whether it's related to brain health, aging, even performance. A decline in that can definitely cause some issues. And I think I'm with you as well, where, although I've taken creatine for so many years, when I initially started taking it, it was primarily for performance benefits. And then over time, it became about really, well, also muscle preservation, energy, cognition, and then to this other element, which you kind of started to touch on, um, but also just how in stressful situations, right? How it can be protective. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? Because I know there's some data on the benefits of creatine even done under like sleep deprivation.
Certainly. And I think that that's that's kind of an interesting and recurring theme when you talk about the effects of creatine is that it tends to limit the negative side effects of stress in different areas of the body and also like mitigates the effects of things like sleep deprivation. But at least in that respect, I mean, we can get to sleep deprivation in a second here, but if we're still talking about mitochondria, I mean, one good example of that is creatine's ability to stimulate mitochondrial biogenesis, not so much by itself, but in response to resistance training. If you were to resist resistance training and have creatine versus resistance training alone, or exercise alone, depending on what kind of training you're doing, you have either greater or lower stimulation of mitochondrial biogenesis. But taking creatine augments mitochondrial biogenesis in response to stress. Giving it by itself, the signal doesn't seem to be strong enough. So you actually have to apply a stressor for creatine to start to work. It's magic. Like that's one kind of stress. If you look at something like sleep deprivation, then under those conditions, I think that kind of underlies a bit of an energy imbalance, and that's kind of the cause of negative consequences of sleep deprivation. So I think a lot of people have heard of, they've seen people talking about, creatine can reduce some of the side effects of sleep deprivation. And it's like, okay, that's cool. But I think that the most unique part of that story is that it can do so acutely. And so that you don't need to take creatine continuously to have that benefit. There actually is an acute benefit to it in that respect. And so it's cool that there are both chronic and acute use cases for creatine where you can see it kind of work its magic under different types of stressful conditions.
Right. Yeah. So I think that's such a good point, right? That there's these acute benefits and even some of these sort of chronic benefits over overuse, and the body of research on creatine is just remarkable now, and it keeps growing in all these different areas, that you're referring to, which makes me think of one other ingredient, one of the most studied ingredients, protein. And I've got to ask because there's a lot of news out there right now around the
Yes.
most recent consumer reports on protein and potential lead contamination. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that. For example, is there, I mean, the fact that people can be exposed to any levels of lead, like, is that something that, people should be concerned about? Because, there was more than, 2 dozen, I think it was about 2 dozen products that were kind of assessed. And, here, I'm really proud, we're fortunate that, our MuscleTech product, our protein containing gainer in this case, actually showed it didn't contain any lead or cadmium. So really, really proud about that. But I think, again, just for, people, just, again, given your experience, just to hear maybe how you'd recommend sort of evaluating that and how you go about just recommending, whey protein supplements, just given that information.
Yeah. So I think you brought up, I think probably the most salient question right there was, um, is any level of lead exposure, like, kind of what does that do? And,
Yeah.
what do we think of that? And so I think it helps to kind of break down the difference between regulatory thresholds and toxicological thresholds. And so, like, regulatory thresholds, even toxicological thresholds, there's more of a consensus there when you go country to country. But regulatory thresholds, they differ, quite a bit. And so in the United States, the FDA does not set legal limits for lead in something like supplements. Instead, what the FDA does is they set something called an interim reference level. That's meant to reflect the lowest amount of lead through which you could take in and not have any observable long-term negative consequences. So through the Department of Health and Human Services, the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry has done some work. They have their toxicological profile for lead, and essentially what they determined was that, and also EFSA, the European Food Safety Authority, they both agree on this. So it is important to note that lead exposure has been studied for over a century, and to this day, the conclusion is the same. There is no safe level of lead exposure. There's no blood level at which you do not see perceived negative side effects, even if it's at the cellular level. Now, I should also note that something that is perceived as negative at the cellular level does not always result in something that is observably negative. But that being said, lead can accumulate in things like teeth and bones, and it can stay there for years and seep out into circulation over time. The good news is that Americans today, compared to Americans in the 70s, have blood lead levels that are 5 to 10-fold lower, due to a lot of the use of, like, lead-based gasolines and paints in the 70s and 80s. But the FDA also had a study in 2020. It was called the Total Diet Study. And so what they concluded there was that through food, Americans are taking in 9 micrograms per day of lead. I need to back up a little bit because I don't think I ever said what the interim reference levels were for the FDA. They set that at 8.8 micrograms per day for adults, 2.2 micrograms per day for children. So those are their reference limits that they set, saying you should try to get under this, or at least no more than this, through your food. So the FDA's Total Diet Study in 2020 determined that American adults are getting about 9 micrograms per day from food. So really just at that interim reference level, and that children are getting 2 to 2.5 micrograms per day from food. So they kind of sit at their interim reference level. Now, that long acronym, the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, they also went a step further and determined that total exposure for the average American, of course, goes well over what you get from food, because we drink water and get lead from that. We breathe in pollutants from the environment. We get lead from that. And so on average, the American adult is exposed to 0.8 micrograms per kilogram of body weight of lead per day. For an 80-kilo adult like myself, that's 64 micrograms of lead per day from food. We're not supposed to get any more than 8.8 micrograms per day. So we have to try to limit it from food as much as possible, because we at least control what we're doing there. It's much harder to control things that are floating around in the environment or that you're being exposed to that you're even not aware of. So fortunately, the European Food Safety Authority, which consults on lead limits for the European Commission, now they produced a position in 2010 suggesting that you would need to, at least for children here, you would need to take in 0.5 micrograms of lead per day to see observable neurocognitive developmental outcomes, at least adverse ones, 0.6 micrograms per day to see adverse kidney effects, and 1.5 micrograms per kilogram of body weight to see adverse blood pressure effects. I don't think I said it for the kidney one, but all of those are micrograms per kilogram of body weight. So for a 50-kilo child, that's 25 micrograms to see negative cognitive developmental outcomes, 30 micrograms per day to see negative effects on the kidney, and 75 micrograms per day to see negative blood pressure effects. And so an adult, you would just double those numbers based on what their body weight is in kilos. And so you go back to the FDA's position that most American adults are exposed to 64 micrograms of lead per day through all kind of routes of administration and exposures. And you think, where is our limit supposed to be? You can basically take those numbers, 0.5 micrograms per kilo per body weight, 0.6 micrograms per kilo body weight, 1.5 micrograms per kilo of body weight, and see, for myself, an 80 kg individual, that's a range of 40 micrograms per day up to 120. Now, negative neurodevelopmental outcomes is more specific to children. And so really that's more of a range of 60 to 120 micrograms per day of lead that I could probably be exposed to. And that's at least that range is where I might see some observable negative impact. But if we're talking about supplements and protein powders, it helps to have all of that contextualized. So we know, well, how much lead am I being exposed to per day on average? How much am I taking in through food per day on average? Because that might dictate some of my choices for which products I use. I mean, I have several products in my cabinet that I know go above that Proposition 65 regulatory threshold for lead. And so they have a Proposition 65 message on it, known to cause cancer in the state of California. One, I think it's really important to note that that is not an FDA set limit. That is a regulatory threshold that is about 20 times lower than the FDA's interim reference level of 8.8 micrograms from food per day. That being said, if the average American is already taking in around 9 micrograms of lead per day from food, then anything that you're taking supplementally then only contributes to that exposure. And so is an incremental increase in lead exposure going to hurt you measurably? It depends what your total exposure load is, really. I mean, the European Food Safety Authority, or EFSA, they had determined that lead exposure sees what's called a no linear threshold model. It exhibits a no linear threshold model, meaning that any incremental increase in lead exposure leads to measurable negative effects of lead exposure, even if it's at the cellular level. And so I think that looking at supplements, things that supplement your diet or your lifestyle, I think that it's always worthwhile to look at what that does to our exposures of lead and other things. I'm not one here to cry out and have people be scared of taking certain supplements. There are certain supplements I take that I know are kind of high in lead, but I take them situationally based on what I think my exposure is, throughout the day. And so to your point, that consumer report, the highest concentration of lead was found in a vegan mass gainer, which is entirely understandable because you're taking 6 scoops of plant product. Plants come out of the ground, and so they absorb lead when they're in the soil. Now, if we look at our European counterparts, it's interesting because the EFSA has their limits, like toxicological limits, what they say that you should be getting under, but legally they allow up to, I think it's 3 milligrams per kilogram of material. So for, say, a 50-gram mass gainer whey protein scoop, that's about 150 micrograms of lead. And so that's quite high, but that's legally acceptable by the European Commission. But EFSA does recommend that you try to lower that as to not experience some of the negative side effects of lead. But to kind of round out answering the question, because I know I'm just kind of blabbering on here, I think that any incremental increase in lead exposure is worthwhile to evaluate. I don't think you need to be scared of products that go above this very hyper conservative Prop 65 regulatory threshold. That being said, we can fall back on the conclusion there is no safe level of lead exposure. So limiting it where we can, I think, is salient advice.
William, thanks so much for joining us today. I think we did a really great job bridging this rigorous scientific literature as well as providing the practical advice for people. So I just want to thank you again for being here.
Yeah, I enjoyed it immensely, Raza. Thank you. And totally okay to do this again sometime.
From all of us at Iovate, just want to thank you all for joining us and stay tuned. We've got a lot more evidence-based discussions coming your way.